Here's Section 1, written as a concise and engaging script with high-quality adult humor, as requested. The door to the tiny apartment slammed shut as Jenna dropped her purse on the counter, glaring at her younger brother, Nate. He was sprawled out on the couch, one sock on, scrolling through his phone like he hadn't a care in the world. "You're late," Nate said without looking up, grinning just enough to piss her off. "I wouldn't be late if I wasn't constantly cleaning up your messes." Jenna tossed the folder onto the coffee table, the contents spilling out. "Do you know how embarrassing it is to be called to a bar at midnight because someone can't keep their tab under control?" Nate sat up and shrugged. "They wouldn't have called if you weren't the responsible sibling. I'm just keeping up appearances." Jenna pinched the bridge of her nose. "Speaking of appearances, Aunt Helen called." Nate froze, his smile disappearing. "Oh no. Not another pyramid scheme." "Worse," Jenna said, sitting down. "She wants us to crash the family reunion this weekend." "Pass," Nate said immediately, leaning back again. "That crowd is worse than Aunt Helen's protein shake parties. Remember Cousin Brenda's wedding? I got stuck between Uncle Larry and his toe fungus stories, and the chicken was undercooked." "It's not a social call," Jenna said, smirking now. "It's a job." Nate raised an eyebrow. "A job? Like a heist job?" Jenna nodded. "Apparently there's an old family heirloom, a brooch, that got misplaced at Grandma's estate years ago. Helen swears it's worth enough to get her out of her latest financial disaster. She wants us to retrieve it." Nate burst out laughing. "Let me get this straight. She wants us, a disgraced bartender and an overworked accountant, to steal a priceless artifact from a house full of our dysfunctional relatives?" "Yes," Jenna said dryly. "But there's a catch." "Of course there is. She thinks the only way to avoid suspicion is if we go as a couple." Nate stared at her for a long moment. Then he fell over, clutching his stomach with laughter. "She wants us to pretend to be married? Oh, this is rich. You're too uptight to pull that off." Jenna crossed her arms. "I'm not the one who'd blow the cover 5 minutes in by hitting on a waitress." "Touché," Nate admitted, sitting up again. "But seriously, Jenna, do you know how weird that is? People are going to ask questions." "Exactly," Jenna said. "And if we don't go, Aunt Helen's going to lose her mind, and probably our Christmas presents for the next decade." Nate sighed, rubbing his face. "Fine. But you're buying me drinks after this disaster." 2 days later, Jenna and Nate stood at the gates of their grandmother's massive estate. The mansion loomed ahead, all colonial grandeur and perfectly trimmed hedges. "This place still smells like mothballs," Nate muttered as they walked inside. Immediately, they were greeted by an enthusiastic Aunt Helen, who pulled them into a tight hug. "My favorite couple is here," she gushed, loud enough for half the room to turn and stare. Jenna stiffened while Nate gave a strained grin. "Couple, huh? That's us. Play it cool," Jenna hissed through her teeth as they walked further into the grand foyer. The family reunion was in full swing, with distant relatives mingling, sipping expensive wine, and pretending they liked each other. Aunts and uncles, cousins of varying degrees, and people Jenna didn't even recognize filled the space. "I'm telling you, this is a terrible idea," Nate whispered, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "Just smile," Jenna muttered. "Jenna!" "Nate!" boomed Uncle Larry, barreling toward them with a grin. "How long have you two been, together?" Nate froze mid-sip, and Jenna jumped in, her voice overly chipper. "Oh, you know, a while now. Time flies when you're in love." Nate choked on his drink, earning a pat on the back from Larry. "That's what I like to hear," Larry said. "Young love. So pure. So unconventional." As Larry wandered off, Nate leaned in close. "He definitely thinks we're into some weird kink." "You're not helping," Jenna snapped, plastering a fake smile on her face. The questions didn't stop. Meddling aunts poked and prodded, asking about their love story and future plans. One particularly nosy cousin asked if they'd set a date for the big day. "Oh, it's all very spontaneous," Jenna said, mentally noting to kill Aunt Helen later. Nate, meanwhile, couldn't resist adding fuel to the fire. We're just enjoying the honeymoon phase, he said with a wink, earning a round of laughter from the nearby relatives. By the time dinner was served, Jenna was ready to strangle him. Could you be any more obvious? She hissed as they sat down at the long dining table. Relax, Nate said, cutting into his steak. You wanted authenticity, right? You're enjoying this way too much. Maybe. But you have to admit, it's kind of fun watching them squirm. As the evening wore on, Jenna and Nate's act became the highlight of the reunion. Their exaggerated affection drew whispers and sideways glances, but no one seemed to doubt them. It wasn't until dessert that Jenna realized how deep they were in. Aunt Helen raised her glass, smiling broadly. To my favorite niece and nephew-in-law, she declared. May your love inspire us all. Jenna froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Nate leaned back in his chair, smirking. You're welcome, he whispered. Section 1 ends at 998 words. Let me know when you're ready for the next section. Here's Section 2 of the script, continuing with the same tone, focus, and humor as requested. Jenna forced a smile as she felt yet another hand pat her on the shoulder. You've got to tell us your secret, Cousin Brenda said, leaning in conspiratorially. How do you keep the spark alive? You two are practically glowing. Jenna blinked, her brain scrambling for an answer. Oh, we just communicate. You know, lots of open, honest dialogue. Brenda beamed. That's so inspiring. I can tell you two are deeply connected. Nate, overhearing, leaned in with a sly grin. Oh, we're definitely connected. Jenna's foot slammed into his shin under the table, but it was too late. Brenda giggled and hurried off, muttering something about relationship goals. What is wrong with you? Jenna hissed as soon as they were alone. Lighten up, Nate said, biting into a bread roll. If we're going to sell this, we might as well have fun with it. Fun? Jenna's voice was barely above a whisper. This isn't fun. It's a logistical nightmare. Do you know how hard it is to keep up with your nonsense while avoiding questions like, how did you meet, and what's your favorite pet name for each other? Wait, Nate said, smirking. What is my favorite pet name for you? Shut up. Before she could walk away, another relative intercepted them. This time it was Aunt Grace, a self-proclaimed relationship expert with 3 divorces under her belt. I've been observing you too, Grace began, her eyes narrowing like she was analyzing prey. And I have to say, there's something electric about your energy. What's your secret? Jenna opened her mouth, but Nate beat her to it. Well, it's all about trust. And trying new things. Jenna's heart sank as Grace's eyes lit up. New things? Oh, you know, Nate continued, clearly enjoying himself. Spontaneity. Role-playing. Sometimes we even argue just to spice things up. Jenna shot him a glare. He means we communicate, she said quickly. Fascinating, Grace said, clearly not buying it. And have you thought about counseling? Not because you need it, but because you could teach others how to keep the passion alive. Counseling? Jenna repeated, her voice going up an octave. Absolutely, Grace said. You two could be a case study. I'll email you some contacts. The moment Grace walked away, Jenna turned to Nate, her fists clenched. I swear, if you keep this up, I'm going to. Relax, Nate interrupted, holding up his hands. I'm just giving them what they want. Besides, it's not like we're going to see these people again after this weekend. Before Jenna could respond, the dinner bell rang, signaling the start of the evening's main event, a formal ballroom dance. Jenna and Nate found themselves on the dance floor, surrounded by couples who looked far too polished for comfort. The music began, and Jenna realized, to her horror, that they were expected to participate. I don't dance, she muttered. Neither do I, Nate replied, grinning. But we don't have a choice. Reluctantly, Jenna placed her hand in his, and they began an awkward shuffle to the rhythm. It was clear either of them knew what they were doing, and their missteps quickly drew attention. You're supposed to lead, Jenna whispered through gritted teeth. I thought you were leading, Nate shot back. Their bickering was interrupted by a round of applause as the other couples began to cheer them on. Apparently, their clumsy attempts were being interpreted as endearing. Look at them, one relative cooed. So in sync, even when they're out of step. They're adorable, another added. Jenna felt her face flush as Nate pulled her into a dramatic spin, nearly sending her flying into a nearby table. What are you doing? She hissed. Improvising, he said, grinning. The dance ended with a flourish that was more accidental than planned, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Jenna wanted to crawl into a hole, but Nate looked like he was ready to take a bow. As they left the dance floor, Jenna grabbed his arm. You're enjoying this way too much. Come on, Nate said, still laughing. You've got to admit, it's kind of fun watching them fall for it. Jenna groaned. Fun isn't the word I'd use. The evening continued with more awkward encounters. At one point, a nosy uncle cornered them to ask when they planned to start a family. Nate, ever the jokester, replied, We're taking our time. Got to enjoy the practice first. Jenna nearly spit out her drink as the uncle nodded sagely. Smart. Very smart. By the end of the night, Jenna was ready to collapse. She and Nate retreated to their guest room, where they could finally drop the act. This is a nightmare, Jenna said, flopping onto the bed. Nightmare? Nate said, sitting in a chair across the room. I think we're crushing it. You're crushing my soul, Jenna muttered. Nate laughed. Admit it. You're having a little fun. Jenna sighed, a small smile creeping onto her face. Maybe. But if one more person asks about our chemistry, I'm going to lose it. Deal, Nate said, raising an imaginary toast. To fake love and real awkwardness. Section 2 ends at approximately 1,000 words. Let me know when you're ready for Section 3. Here's Section 3, following the same tone and style as the previous sections, maintaining the same comedic edge and focus on the characters. The following morning, Jenna woke up to find Nate sprawled across the bed like a crime scene, his legs tangled in the sheets and his arm hanging off the side, as if he'd been kicked out of his own dream. She groaned as she tried to untangle herself from the mess, only to hear the door creak open. Rise and shine, lovebirds! Aunt Helen chirped as she stepped into the room, eyes twinkling. I've got a surprise for you, too. Jenna shot upright, panic flooding her system. Aunt Helen! What are you? Oh, I'm sorry, Helen said with a smirk. Did I interrupt something? Nate, still half asleep, muttered something unintelligible and rolled over. Well, you two seemed so cozy last night, I thought I'd come by and check in. Check in? Jenna repeated, glaring daggers at her. You're really enjoying this, aren't you? Helen just grinned, her smile so wide it could have been a health hazard. Absolutely. You're so cute together. She leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. Don't worry, dear. I've already told the entire family how you two met. You're my favorite couple at this reunion. Jenna felt her stomach turn. Please, Aunt Helen, just... Don't worry, Helen interrupted. I know when to give people space. But as a little treat, I've got something special planned for later today. Trust me, you're going to love it. Jenna sank back into the pillow, eyes closed. I have a feeling I'm not going to love anything about today. Nate, now fully awake, sat up with a yawn. Is it too late to fake a wedding and escape? Probably, Jenna muttered. But don't worry, I'm sure Aunt Helen has something perfectly humiliating in store for us. Later that afternoon, the family gathered in the backyard for a bonding activity, which, to Jenna's horror, turned out to be a trust-building exercise involving blindfolds and romantic obstacle courses. Nate seemed far too eager about the whole thing, while Jenna just stared at the ground, wondering how her life had come to this point. We'll start with the blindfolds, Helen announced, clearly pleased with herself. Everyone will need to trust their partner. She handed out matching blindfolds to each couple. Nate slapped his hands together with an exaggerated smile. Oh, we've got this. Right, babe? He winked at Jenna. Jenna was already regretting every decision she'd made in the last 24 hours. Sure. Let's get this over with. Nate, not one to shy away from a challenge, placed his blindfold over his eyes and offered his hand to Jenna. Lead me, babe. You know I trust you. Don't use that tone. Jenna snapped, immediately regretting it as Helen watched from a few feet away, clearly getting ideas for her next matchmaking scheme. They stepped into the obstacle course, which consisted of uneven wooden planks, buckets of cold water, and a few strategically placed garden gnomes. Jenna was supposed to guide Nate through it, but Nate's tendency to be obnoxious wasn't making her job any easier. I'm just saying, Nate said through clenched teeth. If you get me wet, I'm blaming you. Jenna pushed him forward. Trust me, Nate. Focus. He stumbled. I was focusing, but I think a gnome just winked at me. Jenna gritted her teeth, trying not to laugh. She could feel Helen's eyes on them, and she was starting to suspect that Aunt Helen wasn't as innocent as she appeared. The moment she'd suspected, Nate tripped over the last plank, landing flat on his back in a puddle of water. Perfect, Jenna muttered. Now we're the disaster couple. Nate, soaked but grinning, turned to her with a mock-serious expression. It's all part of the act. Nothing says passionate romance like a little humiliation. Great, Jenna said flatly. I'll be sure to thank you in the thank you speech. Oh, don't worry, Nate replied, standing up and offering his hand. You'll get your moment. Just wait until the real event tonight. Jenna groaned. What is it this time? Don't worry, it'll be fun. A little dinner and dancing. You'll love it. I'm pretty sure you're lying to me, Jenna said. By the time evening rolled around, Jenna was already counting down the minutes until she could escape. The grand dinner setting was too much, too polished, and Jenna felt like she was in a bad reality show. There was no way to back out now, and Helen's beaming face made sure of that. They were seated at the main table, surrounded by relatives who somehow made every conversation uncomfortable. Nate, predictably, was making the rounds with his charm. He was regaling some poor, unsuspecting cousin with a story about how he wooed Jenna. She was totally charmed by my moves, Nate said with a wink. I practically had to fight off the competition. Jenna could feel her face burn. I wouldn't call it a fight, she muttered under her breath. Don't sell yourself short, babe, Nate said, ignoring her completely. You're lucky to be in my arms. Oh, I'm sure, Jenna said sarcastically. The evening continued in that awkward but surprisingly hilarious way, Nate cracking jokes, relatives piling on ridiculous questions about their relationship, and Jenna silently wishing for the night to be over. At one point, Uncle Larry asked how long they'd been dating. Without missing a beat, Nate answered. We've been going steady for, about a year now. You know, the usual, followed by passionate arguments over pizza toppings. Sounds like true love, Larry said, nodding seriously. Jenna almost choked on her wine, trying to swallow down a laugh. Nate's ability to say the most ridiculous things with a straight face was impressive. By the time dessert was served, Jenna had had enough. She leaned over to Nate and whispered, We're done. I can't do this anymore. Nate leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Relax. It's all part of the plan. Besides, I think we're in the clear. I don't care. This whole thing is a disaster, Jenna muttered, looking around at the family members, all staring at them like they were the stars of a weird, uncomfortable sitcom. I'll handle it. We've got one more night here. Just follow my lead. Nate winked. Jenna reluctantly nodded. But deep down, she knew she was getting far more than she'd ever bargained for. Section 3 ends at approximately 1,000 words. Let me know when you're ready for Section 4. Here's Section 4, continuing the story with the same level of humor and maintaining the flow of the previous sections. The next morning, Jenna woke up to the sound of a knock on the door. She groaned, rolling over and glancing at the clock. It was far too early to deal with whatever new scheme Aunt Helen had cooked up. She hoped it was just someone delivering breakfast, but when she opened the door, she was met with a wide-eyed Uncle Bob, holding a clipboard. "Good morning, lovebirds," Uncle Bob chirped, clearly in a good mood. "I've got a surprise for you." Jenna, still half asleep, blinked at him in confusion. "A surprise? Seriously, what now?" "I've set up a little scavenger hunt for you too," he said, waggling his eyebrows. "A sort of bonding experience for the happy couple. You know, to strengthen your relationship." "Uncle Bob, please, no more relationship-strengthening activities," Jenna muttered, stepping aside to let him in. "Oh, but it's all in good fun," he said, pushing past her. "Trust me, it'll be a blast. I've got clues and everything. You two are going to love it." Jenna looked over at Nate, who had just woken up and was sitting on the bed, rubbing his eyes. He didn't look thrilled either. "What's going on?" he asked groggily. "They want us to do a scavenger hunt," Jenna replied, barely keeping her voice steady. "Uncle Bob thinks it'll strengthen our bond." Nate stared at her for a moment, then cracked a grin. "Well, I'll take a wild guess. The first clue is probably going to involve us pretending to be more in love than we really are, right? I'm guessing that's the general idea," Jenna said dryly. Bob handed them a small envelope. "Here's your first clue," he said. "Get ready for the adventure of a lifetime." He dashed off before they could protest. "Adventure of a lifetime? Seriously?" Jenna muttered, holding up the envelope. "Let's just get this over with." She opened it and read the first clue aloud. "To find your next clue, head to the place where love was first sparked. A place where passion and connection ignite." Nate raised an eyebrow. "This sounds like the worst scavenger hunt ever." "You have no idea," Jenna replied. "Let's go." They wandered through the house, following the increasingly ridiculous clues. First, they had to recreate their first date, which involved a candlelit dinner in the middle of the living room. Next, they had to reenact their most romantic moment, which, thanks to Nate's earlier, spontaneous antics, meant an impromptu lip lock in front of a roomful of relatives. Jenna tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, but the whole thing was starting to feel more like a comedy of errors than an actual bonding experience. When they finally made it to the last clue, they were instructed to perform an intimate act of love. Jenna's eyes nearly popped out of her head as she read the instruction aloud. "No way," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and horror. "There is absolutely no chance I'm doing this." "What's the harm?" Nate said, smirking. "It's just a little family fun." Jenna glared at him. "Not in front of your parents. They'll understand," Nate said, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "We're just playing the part." Jenna wasn't so sure, but she went along with it, her face turning red as they walked back toward the dining room. The final, intimate act involved sitting next to each other and pretending to have a private conversation about their future together. As they did, Jenna couldn't help but notice the amused looks from the other guests. Some were nodding approvingly, while others whispered behind their hands. "I think we're almost done," she said, trying to ignore the stares. "Can we go now?" Nate nodded. "One more thing." Jenna turned to him, confused. "What now?" Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it dramatically, revealing a fake engagement ring. Jenna blinked at it. "Are you serious?" "Hey, you never know," Nate said with a smirk. "It could be a great souvenir for Aunt Helen." Jenna's mouth dropped open. "You've got to be kidding me." But before she could react further, Aunt Helen appeared out of nowhere, clapping her hands. "Perfect. Absolutely perfect. You two are the cutest couple." Jenna bit her lip, trying not to laugh. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. "Thanks, Aunt Helen," she said, her voice tight. "We've had so much fun." "Oh, I'm sure you have," Helen said, winking. "You two are such a match made in heaven." "Yeah," Nate said. "If heaven involves a lot of awkward situations and fake proposals." "Sure," Jenna said, shooting him a warning glance. "We're still in character." "Well, it's been a real pleasure watching you two," Aunt Helen said, grinning. And don't forget about the family photo later. I want you both to look extra in love. Jenna could feel her eye twitching. Sure. Extra in love. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of forced smiles, ridiculous family games, and awkward conversations. By the time dinner rolled around, Jenna was ready to call it quits and flee the reunion. But she knew she couldn't. Not yet. At dinner, things only got worse. Uncle Bob, clearly delighted with his scavenger hunt, insisted on showing the entire family a slideshow of the couple's adventures. The slideshow included every embarrassing moment of their day, including the lip lock, the blindfolded obstacle course, and, worst of all, the fake proposal. Look at these two, Bob said, pointing at the screen. You can just see the love radiating from them. Jenna wanted to crawl under the table. Totally, Nate said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I mean, what could be more romantic than pretending to be in a relationship for a weekend? Exactly, Jenna added, her tone equally sarcastic. The family ate it up, though. Laughter and applause followed, and Jenna could do nothing but smile through it. As dessert was served, and Helen leaned over to Jenna, whispering, You two should get married. You're perfect for each other. Jenna nearly choked on her cake. I think I'll pass, and Helen. Well, don't wait too long, Helen said with a wink. The family expects it. By the time the night was over, Jenna was both exhausted and exhilarated. She and Nate had somehow made it through without actually giving away the game. The absurdity of it all had worn her down, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing they'd pulled it off. We made it, Jenna said, slumping into a chair. Nate grinned, throwing his arm around her. Told you we'd crush it. Jenna chuckled, shaking her head. You're ridiculous. And yet you're still here, Nate said, a smug smile on his face. Guess we make a pretty good team. I wouldn't go that far, Jenna muttered, though she couldn't help but smile. It had been an exhausting, humiliating, and unexpectedly hilarious weekend. But one thing was for sure, she wouldn't forget it any time soon. Section 4 ends at approximately 1,000 words. Thank you for your patience throughout. Let me know if you need any further adjustments.